Who the hell is Imre Lodbrog? There's a pithy description I use to describe him to friends. He's like Serge Gainsbourg on shrooms. But if I were to be a little less cheeky, and if I were to elaborate, I'd tell you what I once told Imre in an email. I said, I was thinking about the appeal of your music, and I think it's that you sound like an actor playing the role of an aging rock star, which, if you think about it, is precisely the appeal of many real aging rock stars. Shall I tell you how I came to know him? He actually stalked me first. I have a little habit of posting ukulele cover tunes online. One day I noticed that some character had begun leaving short, enigmatic comments on them. There was one song, a request, I think, a banal little pop song that made reference to trying to keep Paris on my mind, and Imre had quietly left a note there saying that I was on Paris's mind, take my word. I thought that was sweet. I clicked on his tiny icon and it blew up to reveal a somewhat craggy, wizened face, strategically obscured by a pair of rock star shades. And then there was that name. Somebody had to have made that up. The most obvious conclusion to draw was that he was a character invented by my friend, the novelist Harry Matthews. When I asked him outright if he was responsible for Lodbrog, he denied it. Of course, he could be lying. That's happened before, but he seemed so genuinely mystified by my question. The second most likely scenario was that I'd imagined Imre Lodbrog myself, but in fact I knew that not to be the case. The name definitely looked like something I could have made up, or, to be honest, something I could have pilfered from an online anagram generator I use with some regularity. Just to see what it might have been derived from, I ran it back through said generator and retrieved bridal groom, boredom girl, bird legroom, and morbid ogler, all of which seemed weirdly appropriate. Then, of course, I did the obvious thing. I Googled him. It just led me back to where I'd come from. His own musical tracks posted up on the same cloud where he'd found me, and a few YouTube videos as well, where he certainly looked like an aging rock star. Why wasn't he more famous? The guy was clearly a genius. Harry agreed that he was terrific. One of the YouTube videos purported to be a studio session of the Lodbrog brothers filmed in Barcelona. They were playing what appeared to be their hit single, Soixante Piges. I sent the link of this video to my best friend, saying, "This is my new stalker." She said, "Cute. Where do we meet them? I want the one in the chair with a towel on his head." I said, "Imre seems to live in Paris, but I hate to break it to you, I don't think those are his brothers. I think they're all Imre." It took me a minute to figure this out myself, but the resemblance was just too uncanny. It seems he knew how to use a green screen. When I reported this conversation to Imre, I said, "If I'm wrong, tell your brother not to get too excited. My best friend is married to a handsome movie star, and besides, she's not really a risk-taker. I think she was joking." He gave no indication of disappointment. He also neither denied nor confirmed the fictional status of the Lodbrog brothers. There are lots of things I mention or ask in my emails to which Imre doesn't respond. At first, when I asked him who the hell he was, he said that it was a long story, perhaps best told by a fire with a good bottle of Vouvray. He did confess to having made up his own name, and told me that Lodbrog was a famous Viking. I'd already figured that out from my Google search, but Imre added an interesting fact that wasn't on the Lodbrog Wikipedia page. His namesake had died in a pit of vipers. Perhaps you find it an exaggeration to call Imre my stalker. After all, a lot of people leave comments on the things we all post on the internet. The technical term for someone who asks to be alerted to your posts is a follower. Imre was following me. And once I figured out how interesting his music was, I began following him as well. I don't follow everyone who follows me, but if somebody starts stalking me, I tend to stalk them back with a vengeance. The turning point was when I logged on one day and saw he'd posted a new track with the brief and curious title, Browning. Needless to say, I clicked on it. Most people associate my name with the poet or one of the poets, either Elizabeth Barrett or Robert. I'm not sure anybody else has ever associated my last name with a gun manufacturer, but Imre had. He called me a killer. I liked it. Another French guy left a little comment calling Imre an old fox and asking, "A-t-elle écouté ta chanson?" Imre just said, "Qui ça?" That was cute. I decided to avenge myself. I whipped off a cover of one of Imre's songs, one with evidently anti-capitalist content. I tried to reproduce a bit of the dark cynicism of the original. I posted it without commentary. Imre left a note indicating that he was disoriented. I told him when one felt lost, it was always a good idea to go left. Of course, I meant this in the political sense. I was pretty sure we were on the same side. It wasn't long before we were working in collusion. He suggested a duet on the classic theme of Beauty and the Beast. Imre is something of a classicist. I saw his duet and raised him one. I suggested we consider taking our show on the road. I proposed an Eastern European tour in the spring. I told him I had a connection in Latvia. This was true. He said he had one in Lithuania. I felt things were coming together nicely. But as a first step, I proposed we do a show here in New York. I made the invitation on a lark, of course. I didn't actually think he'd accept. He responded by saying something like, "It won't surprise you to learn that I'm penniless, but my son works for Air France, so it's easy enough for me to hop on a plane." Suddenly, I was faced with the reality of Imre Lodbrog as a house guest. I shrugged and asked the rhetorical question, "Imre, how bad can you be?" He didn't seem to understand that the question was rhetorical, so he began to answer it circumspectly. He said something about not telling me where he was in 1992. I hazarded a guess that it was prison. He seemed impressed by my detective skills. How, you may be wondering, did I get us our first gig? Well, this first one fairly fell into our laps. Two artist friends of mine, Courtney Smith and Ivan Navarro, had been given a residency at a gallery in Lower Manhattan. They'd opted to curate a series of performances on top of a sculptural installation that Smith would design, illuminated by Navarro's own sculptural configurations of neon bulbs. For some reason, they thought it might be interesting for me to do something involving my ukulele cover tunes, or possibly the reading of a text. When they approached me about the possibility, a little light bulb went off over my head. Actually, it was more like a very big light bulb, one of Yvonne's massive, glowing neon tubes. I said, "I don't suppose you'd be interested in a collaborative performance with my French stalker." Courtney, being francophone and also one of my closest friends, was already familiar with Browning, a song that she, like me, had deemed an instant classic. She and Yvonne greenlighted my crackpot scheme, no hesitation. Of course, their risk was minimal, there being no expense involved, thank you, Air France. In fact, a Chilean pisco manufacturer had offered to provide free booze. The only person taking a real gamble was me offering this Lodbrog character my guest bed. Well, of course, it was also pretty reckless of him to accept my invitation, which promised no fiscal compensation whatsoever. That part didn't seem to faze him. He did register a little bewilderment, though it wasn't clear whose welfare concerned him, his or mine. He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Imre, throw caution to the wind." He seemed to like that phrase. Imre likes English colloquialisms. I recently sent him a link to a web page that gives an astonishing number of slang expressions for female masturbation. He promptly arranged them into the lyrics of a song. But back to our gig. My idea was to begin the evening with a short literary segment, and then move on to a musical performance of some songs we'd been working on, all of Imre's composition. I like to work right at the border between fiction and nonfiction, and I thought it might be a good idea to factually document the origins of this evidently fictional character who, nevertheless, was creating real music. He did, quickly and willingly, offer up his real name, Sébastien Régnier. It took less than a minute to figure out that he was a French scénariste, evidently a greater succès d'estime than in the box office. I lied and said that although I'd Googled Lodbrog, if he thought I was going to research Régnier, he had another thing coming. I was pretty sure he wouldn't believe me. It was just a minor, friendly retaliation for his own disinclination to figure out who the hell I was. That's not to say that he appeared disinterested, just old-fashioned. He seemed to have accepted that Wikipedia, YouTube, SoundCloud, and Facebook were perhaps necessary evils in the process of contemporary art-making, but if he were giving or getting dirt on his own or somebody else's life history, it seems he wanted it delivered over that bottle of Vouvray or between hits of weed. That wasn't just a question of style. It was becoming clear that despite his hard-ass photo, Imre was the sensitive type. He liked his reality slightly softened, whether by liquid or smoke. He also mentioned a sweet tooth. I made a mental note of all this. There were obviously a few things I'd need to stock up on in preparation for his visit. And then, there was another whole level of preparation. In the 3 or 4 short weeks we had before his arrival, he began assigning me homework. Books to read, films to watch, YouTube links to both Franco and Anglophone songs he thought I should be familiar with. Why the books and films? At first it seemed because they were thematically linked to the compositions he was proposing to me for our repertoire, but pretty soon, when he saw that I was game, it appeared he just wanted to share some things with me that he loved. The first novel he insisted I read was Victor Hugo's L'Homme qui rit. The book was weird. It told the story of the love between a disfigured young man and a blind girl. Their protector was an irascible old mountebank with a pet wolf. For a while, the young man got sidetracked by a spoiled, seductive duchess who found him fascinating despite, or perhaps because of, his disfigurement. I wondered if this was some kind of allegory for us. I asked if I was supposed to identify with the blind girl, the spoiled duchess, or the wolf. Imre said all 3. This would seem to suggest that he was an amalgam of the irascible old traveling huckster and the hideously deformed youth. There was something unusual about the style and tempo of this book. I told Imre, "J'aime les phrases courtes de Hugo." He answered, "J'aime les phrases courtes de Hugo et les longues mais de toi." In point of fact, the message he was referring to wasn't long at all, at least for me. I'm a bit notorious for my electronic correspondence, which I sometimes pilfer for my fiction. I wrote back, "Tu trouves ça long? I'm a monster, Imre. One critic called me the D.H. Lawrence of the email. I'm not sure if you realize what you've gotten yourself into." That didn't seem to scare him particularly. But back to real literature. There was more. Imre wrote me about his love of Cervantes, comparing himself to the hero of his masterpiece. I told him I'd just made this very connection myself in trying to describe him to a friend. And he also loved Calderon's La vida es sueño. These, of course, I knew well, but there was one other book he insisted I had to read. It was the compiled journals and wartime correspondence of Etty Hillesum, a Jewish woman from the Netherlands who chronicled the German occupation. She was just 29 when she died at Auschwitz. Imre said he deeply loved this book, and he'd even gone so far as to join some sort of Society of the Friends of Etty Hillesum in order to remain abreast of any activities or publications concerning her. It's true that the book was immensely moving. At first I thought maybe he'd suggested it to me because Hillesum, like me, was something of a sensualist and prone to passionate defenses of women's sexual independence. I also tend to pontificate on the subject. Of course, given the historical circumstances under which Hillesum was writing, she addressed other questions of freedom as well, but it was impressive how often she came back to the importance of taking pleasure, and not just sexual pleasure, although that was part of it. She also really loved tastes, smells, and people's hands. Also art. She could get very passionate about art. Now, on reflection, I can see the absurd vanity of thinking I had reminded him of Hillesum. The context of horror in which her journals had been written was of an almost unimaginable dimension. Later, when I met Imre's mother, I understood that Eddie had probably reminded him of her. She'd passed through that same horror with the same astonishing embrace of life. When I told a friend that Imre reminded me of Don Quixote, I was referring to the fact that he seemed to be a person who was somewhat more comfortable living in a realm of fantastic tales than what most people would designate the real world. I wasn't referring to his physical type. And yet, when I actually met him, I was struck by his resemblance to the actor Jean Rochefort in Terry Gilliam's famously aborted attempt to make a film version of Cervantes' novel. At other moments, he bore an uncanny resemblance to John Neville as he appeared in Gilliam's The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. It perhaps goes without saying that Gilliam would seem to be attracted to a certain type, and Imre fits the bill. Dignified, poignant, and a little the worse for wear. His features are perhaps closer to those of Rochefort, but like Neville in the role of Munchausen, he's something of a shapeshifter, particularly in regard to his apparent age. He'd told me about that before we met. I'd seen that photograph of his online in which his grizzled and craggy qualities were evident, but he was referring to something else. One of his other videos on YouTube cross-faded eerily and fleetingly between images of him shrouded in the regular Lodbrog armor, fedora, rocker shades, leather jacket, and him denuded, no armor at all. His willingness to shed momentary light on his bare pate and naked shoulders made him appear, well, as I just said, dignified, poignant, and a little the worse for wear. But Imre wanted to make absolutely sure I got the picture before he arrived. He wrote me a couple of days before coming, saying that he'd caught a glimpse of himself in a window on a train, and he was so struck by his own image that he took a photograph. He said it wasn't vanity at all that made him take the shot. On the contrary, he thought I should know that he looked pretty worn out and older than his calendar years. He indicated that the last decade or so had been pretty trying. He didn't say what had happened, but it evidently hadn't been a walk in the park. He was also pretty clear about his material situation. The Air France bonanza notwithstanding, Imre was basically skint, ass out, on stamps. But he said he'd indulged in a little something for his travels. He'd bought a cheap suitcase on wheels at a Chinese import store in Paris. Green, the color of hope. He didn't say what he was hoping for.